Hi, good to see you all, the few that are here. By the way of announcements, so this April 4th would usually be our Pancakes pontification. That is not happening on April 4th this month.
Tell us why, Seth.
Because my wedding is happening on April 4th this year. I'm also not going to be able to be there on April 11th for pancakes, but if people want to do pancakes at the IHOP, obviously we can still hold pancakes then on the 11th at 7 p.m. Mm-hmm. So,
how many would go if we had it?
Yeah. Is there anyone who would maybe be available? If not, we can.
A few maybes if it's.
I'd be available.
I would probably not.
Okay.
There's some other people who went last time that we can ask to. So.
Could ask on Discord, yeah.
Sorry. And then this next week, our next meeting is going to be our Easter meeting. So we're talking about the argument for the resurrection, as we always do every year. So that'll be a good meeting to invite people to and spread the word about that. So other than that, I think those are the main announcements tonight. So,
Okay, yeah, we'll jump right in here to Bible difficulties. I put out a request for questions, and I did get quite a few, which was helpful. So we're going to cover all 6 questions that were submitted. We'll go over these again, but this is just showing kind of the overview slide. So the first question, I reordered them a little bit just to try to make some kind of connection in some cases. So here, the question relates to, in Luke 16, we have this passage where it says, he said to them, this is I should mention the context here. Well, we could read the whole thing maybe first, and then we'll hit the question. So this is either a parable, or if it's a parable, it's the only case where they actually mention someone's name, which is interesting. But a lot of people think it was probably just a parable that Jesus told. But we'll read this real quick and then cover the question. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in anguish and in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in life like men are bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." All right, so that's the whole passage. The question relates to sort of the fairness of this kind of situation, sort of relating to psychology, divine hiddenness. Surely there exists at least one person who, if they received overwhelming and unmistakable evidence of God's existence, would be swayed. So it's a good question that a lot of people have wrestled with over the years, the so-called problem of divine hiddenness. Sometimes we've done a full talk on that. It probably is worthy of doing that again at some point in the future. I think Brian Bell spoke about that. I don't forget how long ago that was, a couple of years probably.
November 2nd, 2023.
Okay, so yeah, it's getting two and a half years or so. All right, so a couple things I'd like to draw our attention to in response to the question, to try to grapple with that a little bit. So one thing as far as like whether this relates to this really global question about, well, isn't there at least one person who did get all this evidence about God's existence and then didn't become a believer? If they're punished, would that be fair, that kind of thing? Or is it really true what Jesus is implying here, that they would be swayed? And I think we have to be careful to look at the limitations in the passage, at least in terms of that extrapolation. The limited context of the question really related to the 5 brothers, where he says, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he, Lazarus, may warn them." So when Jesus is making statements, he's really referring more to the 5 brothers. I mean, you could debate, maybe it's a principle that could be extrapolated beyond that, but it's not necessarily, required by the passage itself, I would say. And then the thing I was thinking about a little bit and trying to think about this is, okay, let's say Lazarus did, if he came back, and appeared to the brothers, how would they respond to that? Would they necessarily even think he raised from the dead? I mean, they might think, oh, sure, yeah, you never died, right, buddy? It might be hard to convince them, even if he did come back from the dead. But I mean, we don't really know, right? Maybe they saw him die or something. That could be different. But it's not totally clear how strong that evidence would necessarily be to the brothers either. And then in thinking about New Testament times and the situation there, a couple of observations. So obviously the rich man who's unnamed, it's interesting that only the poor man Lazarus is the one named here, and that's significant. But his brothers, being rich, were likely also rich. And in this kind of first century context, as a rich Jew, he probably would have been pretty well educated, at least in the Old Testament. And so he actually probably would have known a lot about fulfilled prophecy, such as Jesus is referring to and saying, look, there's strong evidence about Moses and the prophets that could have been persuasive, to you or your brothers, that apparently they weren't accepting. And then the other thing we need to really think carefully about, I think, is the question of belief in God's existence versus trust in God. And I think in that time period especially, the vast majority of people would have believed in God. As far as Jews in first century Palestine, I don't think there's a lot of evidence of like atheism or agnosticism there. However, I think what Jesus is really focusing on is he talks about the word repent. And so they probably, the rich man at least, he seemed to live a life of self-indulgence. He wasn't seeking God and his things. He was living totally for himself. There's a sense in which he might have believed in God, but he just rejected following God. It seems to me more of what's going on in this story. So I think it's definitely clear from Scripture that one can have intellectual belief in God, but not trust or submit to him. For example, James 2:19, some will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works. I will show my faith by my works. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. And so obviously demons believe in God, but they don't follow him. They don't submit to him. They don't repent. They're living in rebellion. So yeah, there's kind of two questions. Now there still is, a key question here of like, why doesn't God reveal himself more? And that can be bothersome to many people, like especially people that are sincerely seeking and don't see quite all of the evidence. It can be frustrating because you're like, why doesn't God make it a little bit clearer? But I do think that that God, he will give you enough evidence. I think Pascal said it well when he said there's enough light for those who sincerely seek him to find him, and enough darkness for those who don't to not. And part of that I view as sort of mercy by God, because the more evidence God gives someone and the more they reject him, the more culpable they are before God, the more guilt they have, the more punishment they're due from God as a just judge. And so in some sense, it could be merciful not to make himself quite as obvious, where it's just accruing more rebellious sin for those who would reject him. But yeah, we need a whole talk to really do that justice. But I know, for example, in the case of Brian Bell, who was someone who came to UTD as not a believer in God, and then he became our president because he did come around and find evidence. And he said for him, he was sincerely seeking, and he really did not know the evidence existed. He had rational reasons because he had just these inputs. He was struggling to get information that would show him that God existed for a while. But once he got it, he responded to it, and he felt that it was very strong, and he realized there was a lot of good evidence out there. And so he says that even though it was frustrating for him, it gave him a situation. He could see the purpose in it, is the main thing I'm trying to draw your attention to, because it led him then to learn a lot about apologetics, learn to help other people that are struggling with belief, because he could empathize with that. I'm in the same boat myself, by the way, having gone through doubts a number of years ago, which is why I wanted to help other people that are, might be struggling, or people that maybe never believed that are looking for evidence, because I came to realize there's actually a lot of evidence, and maybe our pastors don't even always know it that often in church, but it's out there, and we live in an era, information age, where we can make that available to people so they can see the evidence that's in our favor. Was there a question or comment out there? Go ahead.
Well, I would just mention that I'm not sure that Jesus is making a generalization here.
Right.
Where, if he's referring to particular people, characters in this parable, who are particularly defined by their wealth, which we know from other passages in the Gospels is a significant obstacle to believing in Jesus, then it's a pretty small step to say that these individuals, because of their wealth and because of their situation, would not be convinced because that's the position that they have set themselves in. And there still exists a person who, if they had received this evidence that you're talking about, would indeed be swayed. They're just not talked about in this parable. They're talked about in other ones.
Right. Yeah, that was my point number one, is that, we can't really extrapolate from this. But no, it's good. It's a good way of unpacking it more. Okay, let's, well, actually, one thing, this is a brief tangent. Go ahead, Seth. Didn't see your hand at first.
Yeah, and I'd also say, I feel like the generalization that he's trying to get at here, if there is one, I feel like it's kind of just the, if someone rises from the dead, there's got to be the double meaning of that if he's referring to himself as well. But clearly people come to know Jesus through the fact he rose from the dead. So clearly he's not saying this is just pointless of rising from the dead. That doesn't convince anyone. We can't say that. And surely we can't say either that listening to Moses and the prophets is like some kind of prerequisite in order to be convinced of Jesus.
You could be a Gentile Christian convert and not know much of anything about those. So, But I think he is saying that the Jews already had a lot of evidence, and that's why he's kind of pointing back to the problem for you rich, whatever your name is, this rich guy and his brothers, was not the evidence. It was their response to God.
It certainly applies in some cases, but definitely not in all.
Yeah. Just a real brief tangent here. This was covered a couple of years ago, but just to give you an example that there actually is a lot of strong evidence in the Old Testament for it being divine, for God existing, because he would tell the future in advance, things that would happen that would have been hard to predict or force, either one. So I'll just go through this real fast since we've covered it before, but one example that I think is pretty interesting is Babylon, and some of you may not have heard this, I think, but so like in Isaiah, at a time when Israel was very weak and Babylon was very strong, it was predicted that Babylon, the jewel of the kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride will be overthrown, and that she would never be inhabited, which is a really bold claim, right? A lot of cities, will get attacked, destroyed, whatever, then they're rebuilt. Not inhabited. That's interesting. And then it goes on to say later that I will turn her into a place for owls and into swampland. I will sweep her with the broom of destruction. No rock will be taken from you for a cornerstone, nor any stone for a foundation, for you will be desolate forever. Different prophet, same basic concept, but also some specific details, and all of which came about. There's a picture from 1932 which shows that people, this is very unusual. People probably don't realize how unusual it is that when you had a city destroyed in ancient times, first thing people would want to do is like, hey, let's reuse these bricks and building materials and make new things. And they were very good at recycling because they didn't have much wealth or things. And so for it just to be desolate like this is kind of phenomenal. And then from people's understanding of just how powerful Babylon was with, a wall, double wall, moat, four-horse chariot could turn around on top of it. It's quite a turnaround. And you can verify through all kinds of different sources that there was a fulfillment that came well after the prophecy, and it was quite desolate. And in fact, even when they were trying to excavate it in the 1800s, they couldn't dig up parts of it because it was a swamp. It was the water table had changed. All right, so that's just one of many examples of Old Testament prophecy that I think are pretty phenomenal. So like if you look at the picture too of Babylon right here surrounded by, you're kind of in between the Tigris and Euphrates River, you're in the desert. This is a prime real estate. You got to be by water to live in ancient times especially. And so why did they not rebuild it? And it turns out, people did become sort of superstitious about it. People wouldn't want to go there, the Arabs and different things. So that's why it was never inhabited. All right, let's go to question 2, and we're going to cover this one in quite a bit of background. But before we get to the question, I want to kind of put this out there for you guys to think about. So let's suppose, and you've probably all encountered this, even just driving down the roads, you see somebody on the side of the road saying, we'll work for food or something like that. But if someone is asking for it, would it be wrong to take in a homeless person and agree to feed and house them for several years in exchange for work? So that seems pretty good, right? Most of us, we don't really want to do that, right? That cramps my lifestyle or whatever, and I would be more of a sacrifice for me to do that. And so it kind of makes me feel convicted to think about this actually. But in a lot of ways, this was exactly what Old Testament servitude was really like. And it is translated in some Bibles as slavery, but if you look at the actual meaning of this word ebed, it's derived from the root verb abed, which simply means to work or to serve. There's nothing inherently degrading about this. And actually you had people that would use it for leaders as well. So for example, we found this kind of seal where Shema says he's proud to be the ebed, servant of Jeroboam. So, he's kind of bragging about being a servant, an ebed. Jeroboam was a king. So, this person would have been, fairly well off even. So inherently, it doesn't necessarily mean something such as comes to mind for us. And so a lot of scholars think they shouldn't have translated the Old Testament as slave in a lot of those passages. Peter Williams makes a point of this. And he in fact shows that for centuries they didn't translate it that way. And you can think about maybe why someone would have wanted to if they're, I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But this very much was different than, say, American slavery, which is so-called chattel slavery. So there were some distinctives in the Old Testament that were geared towards protecting servants, and this was quite different than other ancient cultures. So for example, in Exodus 21, it says, whoever kidnaps someone and sells him or is caught still holding him, he must surely be put to death. So the American slavery, they would capture slaves from Africa or buy them from slave traders, but the bottom line is you could never have gotten that kind of slavery off the ground. You'd be killing, if you follow the Old Testament, you would have killed everybody that ever stole anyone. So that's a good rule. There was anti-harm laws. Well, we're going to get into one where it looks like maybe it's kind of loose in that regard, but that's what we're going to talk about as a challenging question. But there were definitely a number of provisions, such as, if you injure your servant, you have to release them, things like that, that did protect servants. And this one's really key, anti-return laws. So you had to offer safe harbor to runaway slaves, according to the Old Testament. And so this was an obligation of all Israelites, and there doesn't seem to be like any provisions. It's like no questions asked. If it's a runaway slave, you've got to take them in and help them out. So, and then there's also the principle in the biblical law that servants were to be freed after serving 6 full years. And so this was run on a per individual basis. Whenever you started, you couldn't be a servant for too long. You had to be free after that amount of time. Now there was also a way where if they wanted to stay on, they could become more of a permanent servant and get their ear pierced or something. But that was purely, again, up to the person. But really this whole indentured servitude thing, it is also similar, by the way, to like a lot of people migrating to the US entered into the same kind of agreement, like, hey, pay my way on the ship and I'll do this work once I get there for whatever, 3 years to cover that cost. It was a very similar concept. So this was a voluntary thing people could enter into. Yes, Seth.
About the gag,
Yes.
word there, so it's saying just servitude or servant. Is that a different word than is used when it talks about the Israelites being enslaved to the Egyptians?
I'm not sure. Even if it's the same word, it shows that it would just be an example of words can have a wide range of meanings and so forth. Because clearly there was bad things going on in terms of the Egyptian slavery and how they were treating and just killing a bunch of people and things like that.
In Hebrew has a very small vocabulary, so it would be
Ancient Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah, ancient Hebrew. So it would be very normal, I think, for a word like that to carry a broad range of possible meanings within that category of servant.
Yeah. So you would need to describe additional things going on to say, hey, this was a bad form of somebody controlling it, which, was going on. Okay, now with that background, let's look a little bit at this challenging question here from Exodus 21:20, where it says, anyone who beats their male or female slave, and here it's translating it slave, but that's that same word, ebed, with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. All right, and then also, is slavery intrinsically evil? Why positively legislate it? Why didn't God create a world where slavery never becomes institutionalized? All right, now, to start with, I would like to suggest that's not the ideal translation here from my research, what I can see. And I know Peter Williams, who we had speak here, the scholar from Cambridge, who's really an expert on ancient languages and things, he's pointed out that if you actually look at the Hebrew, the word here that's translated as property is actually silver. All right, and he wants to make the case that this may be, let me get to this part. He points out that there's other passages in the Torah in these first 5 books where they provide guidance to judges. It's almost like case law. So like in Deuteronomy 22, if a woman is raped in the countryside, so normally, as long as she cries out, then, the guy gets this, terrible punishment and so forth. But you wouldn't even know, right? If they're out in the countryside, no one's around to hear. So you always give the woman the benefit of the doubt in like a scenario like that. So there's some things in the Torah like that that are enumerated. And he wants to say that this is probably pointing out that that this servant is something that the master would have valued. And so you want to make an assessment here of, well, first of all, notice that if the servant dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. Okay? So you actually are killing the master if he intentionally killed the servant. So that's capital punishment. Okay, so you want to be careful and like, is this first degree murder or is this second degree murder? It's almost that kind of thing, like manslaughter. Was it intentional? Or maybe were both of them fighting? We don't know who started it. We don't know all the stuff going on, but maybe the servant died after a day or two, so it was less likely then to have been something done with intent. And we don't know if the servant was the aggressor. There's just a lot that's not known here. But what Peter Williams argues is that this passage points out that the slave or servant owner had a financial incentive not to harm his servant who was, he was working off, he would have owed this master something. He was trying to work off a debt. And so you should give the benefit of the doubt that it wasn't an intentional thing. Now, it still could be very bothersome, obviously, just that the servant died, obviously, is a big deal. But again, note that in the Old Testament, it does have provisions like I mentioned about runaway servants and that you're obligated to help them. So the servant at any time could just run away and find refuge in other places, getting help from other people if the masters were getting abusive and things like that. And what complicates this a little bit too here is you would sometimes have like prisoners of war. I mean, there really were no prisons in ancient times. They didn't have a lot of money. You didn't have, good weapons for protecting. So you might have you might have a prisoner of war even. It's hard to say exactly what was going on here that led to this kind of fight. But I agree, it looks challenging, it looks hard, but I think if you look at it in the context of the whole Testament, you get a better appreciation for, it's really not trying to set up situations where people are getting abused and treated as property and things like that. So I think we want to follow the principle of biblical interpretation where we use the clearer passages to interpret the unclear ones. If you have one or two isolated things that seem inconsistent with other scriptures, it's more likely then that you're misinterpreting them or things like that. And so I think it shouldn't be read as translating this as like, oh, this servant is your property, do whatever you want with them, kind of thing. But the overall message from the Bible is quite clear. Galatians 3 is a beautiful passage written by Paul under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, I think. But there's neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free man, there's neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. The radical thing about Christianity was the degree to which it did really treat everyone uniformly for the first time in world history, really. And that Jesus explicitly said that he came to proclaim release to the captives and set free those who are oppressed. And then you do have a whole letter in the Bible, Philemon, written where Paul is appealing to Philemon to release Onesimus, who was a slave. And the kind of slavery there probably was a little bit more like the American kind, not the servanthood of ancient Israel. By contrast, if you look at Islam or something, you have Muhammad buying, selling, capturing, and owning slaves. And, it's not just a tangential, questionable thing here or there. It's very much core to the text. It's very clear from, the historical record on that. What I found surprising when I first learned it a number of years ago was even, great thinkers like Aristotle and Plato, who I think really did have a good moral framework in a lot of areas, but they had a blind spot on slavery themselves, kind of for different reasons, but both of them actually defended slavery in their writings as just kind of being a natural thing. Some people are destined to be slaves kind of mindset. So that's really bothersome. So I think it was really Christianity, and a lot of secular thinkers really do credit Christianity with, changing people's perspectives on how everyone is special. And it's because of this notion that humans are made in the image of God. And that's why this passage bothers us, right? When you read it as translated a certain way, it does look kind of bothersome. But I think if you look at the Bible as a whole, you get a little better perspective on it. Christopher Wright, Old Testament ethics, in this book, he says, no other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves as distinct from injury done to the slave of another master, and the otherwise universal law regarding runaway slaves, but that they must be sent back with severe penalties for those who fail to comply. I already mentioned that, but the key point is that no one else had these kind of laws in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. Rodney Stark, who wrote for years many books as an agnostic about the influences of Christianity on positive impacts of Christianity, eventually he became a Christian because he saw this huge impact from Christianity historically. And he said that all classical societies were slave societies. Amid this universal slavery, only one civilization ever rejected human bondage, Christendom, and it did it twice. Some of it was already discussed in the very early centuries, but In particular, he highlights how in the early 9th century, Bishop Agobard of Lyons said, all men are brothers, all invoke one same Father God, the slave and the master, the poor man and the rich man. There is no slave or free, but in all things and always there is only Christ. And that soon no one doubted slavery itself was against divine law. And then we do see examples, of course, it's pretty well known. Lincoln, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, William Wilberforce, who in the UK led the very long fight to end slavery. There's a great movie about that you should see if you haven't, if you're not into books. But Christianity has had a positive impact on fighting slavery, but you could still be bothered by, like, why does it even mention some of the stuff about servanthood and this and that? But I think here we also want to think about this principle, that sometimes the Bible will regulate the non-ideal to prevent worse evils. And so a really good example of this, the clearest one, I think, is when Jesus refers back to, he's answering a question about, let me just read it. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. So he's saying, look, there was a provision in the Mosaic law, but it was because of the hardness of your hearts. It wasn't like God's ideal for all times, for all people. But because you guys were divorcing your wives anyway, he's like, you better at least follow this principle of giving them a certificate, doing things that could help them in that society as a divorced woman, things like that. And so this kind of shows you that you shouldn't necessarily view everything in the Old Testament as like ideal for all time, for all peoples. And I think the same is true even for this kind of indentured servitude that we do see in the Old Testament. There's other examples too, like polygamy. A lot of even the people that were following God married multiple people, but it's clear from Genesis, from the beginning, the same thing Jesus is referring back to, that it's supposed to be one man, one woman for a lifetime. And you do see from the narrative of the text, often you see the problems from the multiple marriages and the problems it causes with kids. And some of the scholars have pointed out, like, sometimes it's not real explicit, but the narrative itself is conveying such a negative message of the impacts of this sin. Also kings, that was not ideal, but they really bugged Samuel the prophet to, like, hey, we want a king and all that. And then, he prophesied, here's what God says, you're going to have all these problems from kings. He allowed them to do it, but it wasn't God's ideal, really. So you do have that going on in the Old Testament sometimes. This is from Dr. Peter Williams. I thought was kind of a good summary, just showing how different the Old Testament servanthood was from, say, Roman or New World slavery. Were you allowed to go on holiday? Yes, in the Old Testament only. Were you given enough food? Yes, in the Old Testament only. Did you have legal redress? Yes, Old Testament only. Sexual protection, you couldn't just go rape your servants and slaves. That was only the Old Testament. You could get away with that in these other contexts. What about kidnapping? It's the opposite here. Old Testament prohibits it, no one else does. Same with chains, torture, and physical abuse. So it's very different. But yeah, anytime we hear the word slave, it's easy to kind of picture more of the worst things in our American history, which, they do. It's right for us to just think that it's so terrible. But this was something else going on. Now then you could also ask, well, why wasn't there more in the New Testament, for example, about just tell everybody to end slavery and stuff like that? That's also a legitimate question to ask and think through. And in fact, there were some people, I've seen different estimates on this, maybe 30, maybe 50% of the early church were slaves. And here we are talking about the Greek or Roman kind, and not just like the Jewish kind, all right, of servanthood. So some of the problems were, let's say that you did say that. Okay, well, you might just be telling them to do something that would get them killed. Okay, so that's maybe not a good idea. And then also those advocating for it would also be killed. And then you also think about, like, just even advocating for changing laws doesn't always solve the problem, right? You really want, it seems like the Bible's focus is always on changing hearts. changing people. Because, I mean, even if it was against the law to have slaves, some people would still do it, and it wouldn't make that big of a difference. You got to change people to really do away with something like this. And in fact, Christianity has helped a lot anyway with ending slavery. Although I should point out that worldwide, there's still more slavery going on than people realize, I think. Some estimates of like 20 million and so forth. Now, it is true also that in early church leaders, there were a lot of funds allocated to free slaves. So the early church was very involved in freeing. They would do it primarily by just buying them off and just saying, hey, I'm going to give you this money, and then they would just let the person go, live freely. So yeah, there's a group today where you can, I actually did this week because I thought, wow, I really should do something to help with this problem. And so I gave that group some money, and you can free slaves in Sudan today by giving money to the Christian Solidarity International. The other interesting thing is that you can see the attitude of the early church toward slaves in that we had some popes that were actually former slaves. Now, we're not totally sure about Pope St. Pius I, but his brother was Hermas. You may have heard of the Shepherd of Hermas. He was a slave, and so it's probably likely that his brother was. So that's pretty interesting. That's pretty early on, too. But I think we know for sure that Pope Callistus I in the early 3rd century was definitely a former slave. So I think it's really cool that, you know, you could become Bishop of Rome, Pope, whatever, even coming from this kind of background. It shows a good attitude towards those, from those early Christians. All right. Any quick questions or comments about any of the question of slavery? There's a lot more that could be said on this, and I did spend a fair amount of time. I guess we have to leave time for the other questions and see how we're doing. All right, let's jump into question 3. So this one has gotten a bit of conversation in apologetic circles sometimes, and it's a good one to talk through. In Matthew 27, it talks about, at that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. So we have this historical record of a publicly observable mass resurrection in Jerusalem during Passover. Wouldn't that be recorded in multiple places, yet this is the only mention of it anywhere? So it does raise some questions, applying the normal historical criteria, which we like to do, and that's part of how we make the case for the resurrection of Jesus, like these multiple attested accounts. Here is an example where it's kind of weak, right? You just have one source, and you might think, well, wouldn't other people talk about this? All right, so let's unpack that a little bit. I should mention here that Mike Licona, he's kind of a well-known apologist. He's one that I disagree with on some things, and this is one of them, where he would just say this is Jewish apocalyptic or metaphorical language. He just kind of takes it metaphorically. I know some people like Norm Geisler. This was years ago. Norm's passed away now, but he's famously opposed this claim and said, like, you can't really claim to be an inerratist if you make this kind of liberalization of the text. But I think that is a possibility, at least. I don't think we should demean Licona, even if we end up disagreeing. But I think the main point, and this is one that Tim McGrew has really driven home a lot in general, is that if you look at ancient literature or historical things, there's a lot of examples where you think people would have mentioned things and they don't. So he has like this huge long list of pretty interesting things. I'm going to share a few on an upcoming slide here. But fundamentally, this is sort of an argument from ignorance, where it's like, or argument from silence, I guess I should say. Like, you know, it's pretty silent on this issue. We only have one source. Okay, yeah, that can be a weakness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it didn't happen, because we have a lot of examples from ancient history where we know something happened, but people are not writing about it. And I think the thing that people don't realize is just how few works we have from the 1st century Palestine. Like, it's not like there was hundreds of books that we have today where we can go look at what people wrote about then. I did some research, used some AI to try to help, and there's very little. There's a lot in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essene community was living in caves. They were very isolated, though. Like, they wouldn't have even seen this, probably. So they wouldn't be expected to write about it. You had Josephus coming later. Maybe he could have mentioned it or something. Maybe the other disciples. But a lot of people think, the Gospels were aware of each other. And so maybe they don't have to repeat something. They're not always trying to, just cover the same ground, I guess. At least in the case of like John, where he's written later and probably knew about the other three. All right, so, this is the backwaters part of the Roman Empire. And even among things that we know were written, like a lot of times we'll find out, here's the name of some book or writing by this author, but we don't have any record of it. It's like just disappeared from history. No copies remain long enough to get copied to persist to the present day. And it's primarily because they would write it on papyrus, which is very degradable unless it's just super dry. We have a few ancient papyri from Egypt where it's just incredibly dry, never rains, that were buried. And a few of those from this long ago persist, but very, very few. And even those are quite fragmentary. So there's really just not a lot out there. You shouldn't expect there to be a lot of writing about anything from the first century in this area. The other thing is, if you think about the focus of that day, it was obviously on Jesus, right? You have this public execution. He had a big following, but he also was a polarizing figure. The Romans didn't particularly like him. Some of the Jewish leaders obviously didn't like him. And so the focus of when people would be thinking about that day, I think it would be more about Jesus and not even these other things that might have happened. And then you have other things, even as these verses that we read, there was apparently an earthquake, there was darkness, there was a lot of things going on that day to talk about, but it was all interpreted as being because of Jesus, and that God was showing evidence that this was my son, something significant happened that day. And so most of the people writing about it would focus a lot more on Jesus than these other people. It may have just been it is a pretty wild thing, a pretty crazy sounding thing. All these people rose from the dead that day. But again, it could have just been one of the wild things that God did to kind of show, just like the Roman centurion said, surely this was the Son of God about Jesus, because he saw these wild things happening. He saw the impact. And maybe even just seeing how Jesus dealt with the other ones being mocked on the cross and things like that. So I think arguably people who knew about all these crazy things happening would want to write mostly about Jesus. And maybe if someone was opposed to Jesus, they don't even want to talk about any of it, right? So I don't know if we should necessarily expect a whole lot of writing. It could still be a little surprising, but then you also think about the randomness of what survives historically. There's going to be some areas of things that are just not very multiply attested. So here are some of the examples from McGrew where the argument from silence fails as applied to history. So Ulysses S. Grant, he kept a daily, very detailed personal memoir or diary during the Civil War. And so every day he would write, pretty much all the stuff that's going on, but he makes no mention whatsoever of the Emancipation Proclamation. So, you finally, in this war, free the slaves. There's no mention of this. It's just because it's very surprising. It's like, why didn't he mention it? But we know it happened. But it's very surprising that he would not write about that. Marco Polo, he traveled to China for quite a while, and he wrote a lot about what happened there. But he makes no mention of the Great Wall of China. And so, as Tim McGrew puts it, Marco, what's this 1,000-mile long, huge thing? He talks about all this other stuff, but he doesn't mention the Great Wall. And it's true that some of the later, this is like 13th century, so some of the later stuff made the wall even more impressive. But still, and because it was so old, there wasn't anything like that in Europe, and it should have stood out to him. But for whatever reason, it's not mentioned. Josephus and Philo, two people who were writing in the first century in Palestine, they don't mention Emperor Claudius expelling Jews from Rome in 41 AD. That's a pretty big deal. Both of these are Jewish writers. Josephus writes about the history of the Jews and so forth. Doesn't ever mention this. However, we do have from Acts and Suetonius, Roman historian, we have multiple attestation that in fact Claudius did expel Jews from Rome. That's why Aquila and Priscilla show up in the book of Acts. Pliny the Younger documents his firsthand witness of Mount Vesuvius eruption, so much so that some of the words scientifically for volcanic eruptions, they refer back to Pliny, because he has this very detailed, and he doesn't mention though that Pompeii and Herculaneum, however you say that, were buried. They were completely buried and lost to history for centuries. It's kind of a big deal when you have a decent sized city completely covered. And likewise, you have other people who tend to write about natural disasters but fail to report that. Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So there's some very surprising examples where the argument from silence fails historically. So it at least shows that you shouldn't put a whole lot of stock in anything that's just kind of singly attested. I mean, it could still seem very surprising for someone for a miracle of that type, but I mean, once you're dealing with God, you have the possibility of miracles. So the other thing I'd mention is that we do have some limited evidence for some of the other crazy things that day, like the darkness and earthquake. And again, it's only Matthew that mentions the earthquake, but we do have attestation of that. The Greek author Phlegon, he was kind of like Ripley, how Ripley's Believe It or Not, he wrote about strange things. And so he has some recording, and it happens to be the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, 33 AD, which is the likely year of the crucifixion. And he talks about the great eclipse of the sun. Now, in reality, we know there couldn't have been a solar eclipse because it was a full moon when Jesus died. But people would have naturally kind of interpreted it as some kind of eclipse. So that's why they try to explain that away. And there's also a recording of an earthquake. We also have apparently a Greek historian, Thallus, writing in 52 AD, talked about the darkness and that it corresponded to this day of Jesus' death. Now, we don't have his writings, but we have someone a little bit later who's quoting from that, Julius Africanus. He was a pagan convert to Christianity, entrusted by the Roman emperor to set up his library in the Pantheon at Rome. And he was trying to point out, look, this couldn't have been from a solar eclipse because of the full moon and so forth. We also have Tertullian writing and referring back to the archives and saying, look, you have records in your own Roman history about this. Now, you could argue that he's just making this up, but if they really either didn't have archives they could check, they would know he's lying, or if they did, they could go look. It's, the more things like that you just make up, the more you put yourself in a position where they could just kind of disprove your whole testimony. So it's not a real good case for people just making up stuff like this. All right, the fourth question, this is a tough one as well. Is this a command to kill babies? 1 Samuel 15:3. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children, infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So here's a question relating to divine command and moral goodness. God appears to be commanding something intrinsically evil, killing morally innocent infants. All right, so the first thing I would mention there is that if God was intentional, if this passage records God doing something that's definitely evil, I think the natural thing to do would be to conclude this wasn't part of the original scripture, and it would never be in a category of like disproving Christianity or something like that. It'd be more of like, oh, this text must have been monkeyed with or something like that, if that is what it's actually doing, because obviously God couldn't command something evil. There's no evil in God. So I think it's sometimes helpful to kind of put a worst case, even if, this other alternative may not work, the end result of that is not atheism or disproving Christianity. It's more just, okay, yeah, maybe that didn't really say that originally, or if it did say it originally, maybe it shouldn't have been in the Bible or whatever. It wasn't inspired. But I think there are some mitigating things here that some scholars make. You can decide if you think it's a good enough case or not. But in particular, Paul Copan is a scholar He's written now 3 main books dealing with some of the really challenging parts of the Old Testament. And there are, let's admit, there are some challenging things. His first, I think this was his first of the 3, is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. One of his key things that I think is definitely true is that a lot of this was ancient Near Eastern hyperbolic language. He thinks it should not be taken literally. He thinks the original audience wouldn't have taken it literally, and that kind of thing. So, like today, if you look at a sports page or something, it might say the Cowboys crushed the Giants or slaughtered the Redskins or something. And of course, we know it doesn't mean they literally killed a bunch of Indians or something, right? So it's the same thing. Like, well, if you look at the dictionary and look at what those words mean, slaughter, you could say, well, they slaughtered them or something. And it's definitely true that there was a lot, across all cultures of the ancient Near East, they would use these kind of phrases that even included like whatever, women and children. So it's kind of bad, and you could say they probably shouldn't have used that language. But I think it really wasn't a literal thing going on where they were killing infants and things like that. And I think a key part of the evidence that convinced me that he was onto something was if you look carefully at the Old Testament texts, you'll see a case, and in fact this passage is one of them, where it indicates a total destruction of the people, but then a few verses or a few chapters later, you see that slaughtered group showing up. And it's like, wait a minute, I thought you said they were all killed, and yet they're still here. And that shows you that maybe it didn't really mean they were all killed, kind of thing. And actually, the word harem is what is often translated as utterly destroy. Okay, and again, this is one of those words that has a range of meanings and so forth. But I think Copan and other scholars argue that this word haram shouldn't really be translated as like utterly destroying a people, but likely means more of a consecration or removing of human use. He would point to an example like the Nazism. You wanted to utterly destroy Nazism in Germany and just root out that ideology because it was very evil and so forth. It doesn't mean you necessarily kill everybody who was a Nazi, but if, some of them you did have to kill in order to defeat Nazism. And it was a similar thing in some of these Old Testament cultures. There was a sense of capital punishment. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but it seems to be an element of sin and capital punishment for severe levels of evil. There definitely was this kind of divine judgment, specifically against the Amalekites and other Canaanite people due to their sin. But also the thing that Copan points out is that there are more verses about them being driven out than them being killed. So the main goal was they were to be driven out of the land as punishment for their sins. But obviously, some of them were killed. There was some element, perhaps, of capital punishment as well for those who would oppose being driven out. But it definitely was not a genocide in the sense of there was no ethnic motivation. It's clear from Scripture that it's claiming internally to be as a result of sin. They were rejecting even just real basic things that other cultures would not have done, even if they were not followers of God, Yahweh. So in Genesis 15:16, it says, "It will be 4 generations before your descendants come back here, because I will drive out the Amorites until they become so. I will not drive out the Amorites until they become so wicked that they must be punished." I did a little research on this word Amorites, because at first I thought, well, this doesn't really help with Amalekites, does it? But this definitely is a term that meant sort of Westerners. It would have referred to people like the Amalekites. It's a very general term. And so God was basically saying in this verse, this was very early, obviously, in the Torah, in the first 5 books, that it's too early. I can't punish them yet. Their sin hasn't reached this level of wickedness that demands the kind of punishment that he knew would come later. And what is the wickedness? One example of a lot that could be said that's really heartbreaking is that we've now seen from archaeological evidence that, in fact, there was widespread child sacrifice in this area by these people because of their perverted religion. So they would find, for example, burned 2-year-olds in jars and things like that. And so it's like, this wasn't just like infant mortality, you bury some baby because they didn't survive childbirth. These were actually intentional burnings and things of young people. We found the altars and the idols in the altars and things like that. So there was definitely a level of wickedness that was deserving of punishment. And at that point, they're violating all the, that would take a lot to make a parent kill their kid. That's a really, it's really gone down a lot at the point where a culture reaches that level. All right, I mentioned that about the Amorites. So let's go back and look at 1 Samuel 15 again. So really he says, if you look at this word haram is used in this particular passage. And so there's some level of destruction that's commanded, but it may not mean kill everybody, even though then you have this verse, which also Copan would argue is not meant to be taken literally in terms of just killing everybody. But if you look at the passage, what's interesting is that Saul, he does get in a lot of trouble for disobeying, and he leaves the king around, but the king is the one that's very tied into sin. And actually Samuel, the prophet, ends up killing him in kind of a brutal passage. But, he says to him, you've killed all these people, God's commanding you to be killed and things like that. It was definitely capital punishment. But Saul, it says, it utterly destroyed all the people. It says that he did do all the killing that was required. He got in trouble for not killing the one person, the king, and for selfishly taking all these animals. In other words, he wanted the booty from the war. He wanted the money-making animals, things like that. He had sent word to other people in this area, the Kenites, to flee the battle scene. And so I think it would have been quite obvious to families as well. Like if you're about to be attacked and all these other people are fleeing, they would know that they need to flee as well. So likely there would not have even been any women and children, in the battle. And then sure enough, this is one of those many examples in the Old Testament where you see the Amalekites showing up, even though it said Saul destroyed them all. So they weren't really all killed because David has to fight them not that much longer. And in fact, if you think about the ages, since David was the next generation king, he would have been basically fighting those children. So the children grew up and he had to fight them because they were fighting Israel. So yeah, it seems like there wasn't really killing of children here. But I admit, it's really bothersome to read that verse where it's telling him, what do you have to add, Kenneth?
I just have a question. Does it complicate our interpretation of the verse that it's God actually giving this command? Because if God is being transcribed accurately here, one who gives very specific instructions in other parts of the text, then how justified are we to say that he was also giving a military command while also exaggerating himself?
That's a good question. I think it does make it harder. Yeah. I mean,
there's other answers.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's other examples. I did hear some people talking about that point specifically in terms of like there's other examples of where God's using hyperbolic language and dealing with people in the Old Testament and stuff like that. And then maybe the person writing it down, was this literally a voice that they quoted verbatim, or was this just more of somebody writing down the overall general intent? Because, they didn't even invent quotation marks until centuries later. And so I don't think we should view it as God said, quote, unquote. But yeah, it is seemingly coming from God. That makes it a little more challenging. But if you think about the fact that it was almost certainly a paraphrase, and we're seeing it from the author's perspective of what he felt like God was saying, more than a direct verbatim quote, that might soften it a little bit. That's a good question. That's a tough passage. That's a tough question. And like I said, worst case, if there wasn't an answer for this, I think the right answer would be not that God is immoral, God doesn't exist, Christianity is not true. None of that would follow. It would just be, hey, they might have changed this verse later. Some nationalistic Jews came along or whatever. But I think there's a reasonable, plausible alternative, though, offered by Copan and other scholars that maybe it just was some capital punishment and it was non-literal language. Let's get in then to, let's see how we're doing on time. maybe just for the last one, we'll talk a bit about the concept of hell. Is that fair? So in Matthew 25, it says, then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. How come finite beings who commit a finite number of sins receive eternal punishment? Why not allow reforming the will after death? So that's a good question, and this is a very common apologetics issue that we have to all wrestle with, because hell is a very negative thing, and it could seem excessive and so forth. And I do think Scripture clearly says we're destined to die once, then face judgment. Some Catholics think about a purgatory. Maybe there is a chance. If they're right about that, then maybe there is some kind of second chance. But I don't see it in Scripture personally. But and then we could also look at what we do see in Scripture clearly is that God does go to great lengths to help people find Him in this life. He arranges where they live and things like that. Even according to Acts 17, He determines their times and boundaries of habitation, so that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He's not far from each one of us. So people that would find God, He puts in positions where they could find God potentially, or at a minimum you could say that God will not judge unfairly someone who has no knowledge about Jesus, things like that. There's different views among Christians, but the bottom line is you could say, well, yeah, God is going to treat them fairly based on the light that they do have. That's what we're responsible for. And it is clear from Romans that a certain amount of light does hit everybody from general revelation, that we all know that there's a God. Scientific studies show people grow up, even if they're in atheist households, believing in some kind of all-powerful God. So there's some knowledge of God that we tend to start off with. Sometimes, and especially in our Western cultures, we can be educated out of that, so to speak. But it's something that would otherwise be there. And so you have to ask, did I even have a good reason for rejecting that? So some have pointed out that, well, okay, one of the things, though, is that if you keep sinning in hell at any finite rate, then the number of sins goes to infinity, is just like the time does. That's one of the potential responses. And then Kenneth, actually, I think, is an advocate of this annihilationism. Some people think that we've misinterpreted the concept of hell. Chris Dade is a good scholar who makes that case. It's not viewed as heretical. I don't personally hold to that. It's one of the possible views that maybe hell is ultimately an ending point. It's not in any way an eternal punishment. Do you want to make any comment on that? Or?
I would just add that I certainly believe that there is punishment for
Yeah.
those who are not repentant. But when this is referring to eternal punishment in this verse, there's a difference between punishment that is lasting eternally and a punishment that is of an eternal nature, where the effect of this punishment is indeed eternal. You're not coming back.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, that's an interesting thing that, if you haven't ever seen that, it's a more powerful case than most people think. I'll just say it at that, even though I personally haven't been convinced by that. The other thing people point out is that, well, wait a minute, if God is this unlimited, perfect being, He's in some sense infinitely good, you could argue that a sin of rejecting Him might be worthy of a permanent separation because of God is that amazing. So there is that aspect as well. I do think part of why hell seems problematic and we need to think about a little bit is that our views of hell are probably colored a little bit even by some of the medieval distortions that are out there, Dante's Inferno and some of the different things that greatly, there's some interesting paintings from medieval times about hell that are just really creepy. I didn't want to put some of them up there because they're so crazy. But many people have pointed out, well, wait a minute, if you look at some of the biblical metaphors, they're definitely metaphors. You shouldn't take everything there literally. It does talk about a place of darkness. Because you're separated from God, that's a natural kind of thing to think about. It's like you're lacking the light, the clarity of God. Maybe it is dark in a literal sense too, I don't know. But then when it talks about fire and darkness, those two seem to be contradictory, as some have pointed out. So that would be more argument for taking it somewhat metaphorically when it talks about a place of eternal fire and a place of darkness. You can't have, in some sense, a total version of both, at least. The other thing is that sometimes people think of it as an eternal place of torture. And it's like, wait a minute, I've never seen the word torture in the Bible about hell. It does say the word torment, but torment is more of an internal thing. People may be very sad once they realize they're separated from God and realize more about who he is, what they missed out on. That's definitely a thing. It is a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth in some sense, but it may be more of just an internal thing. A lot of people say, aren't we going to be bored in heaven? Heaven sounds terrible. What if that's more of what hell is like? What if it's not so much God is actively punishing people, it's just more of like, you have no God, you have no positive influences, and it degrades over time, and you're bored. That might be, that could be worse than you think it is too, right? If you really think about how that goes over time. So there's not a lot of specific details about heaven or hell in the Bible. I would say there's some. I think the message it clearly wants to send is like, you need to be warned. Like, you're not going to like being separated from God. And it's trying to warn you, because it would not want to under-warn you in that sense. And heaven is pretty amazing, but it also doesn't want to make people like commit suicide to go to heaven or something. So it doesn't give us a whole lot of detail about that. But even in near-death experiences, reports that we've talked about before, people talk about it was so amazing, they didn't want to go back to this life, and they're probably not really in what we would call heaven, but there's some pretty interesting documented cases of near-death experiences where they talk about their sensory, everything they could see better than anything else. They have examples documented of blind people having near-death experiences and being able to see and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there that points to something amazing going on with heaven. And I do think, as just we close out in the last minute here, C.S. Lewis has a lot of good things to say about hell that really get you thinking. He wants you to consider a world in which you have God and choice. Can you avoid something like the concept of hell? Should God force everyone to be with him? Because it doesn't seem right either. Like, if some people don't want to be with God, should he force them to be with him? Arguably not. And that's really all hell might be in some sense. And then would heaven still be heaven with rebels against God there? If you're trying to create an environment where people are not rebelling against God and it's peaceful and happy, do you have Adolf Hitler there? It doesn't really make sense. And so he proposes that the damned are in one sense successful rebels to the end. The doors of hell are locked from the inside, on the inside. So that's an interesting way of thinking of it as well. And then I like this quote from The Great Divorce. There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. So you're either someone who wants God's will to be done, or if you ultimately reject that and just want to choose your own will, he's going to give you that. That's the point of Lewis. He says, to be God, to be like God, and to share his goodness in creaturely response, to be miserable, these are the only three alternatives. If we will not learn to eat the only food the universe grows, the only food that any possible universe can ever grow, then we must starve eternally. And so he's just trying to point out that God is this ultimate source of goodness, and if you cut yourself off from that, that's what you end up with is something that is pretty bad, and that's all hell is that separation from God. Mike Winger, there's some good videos online on this. He's kind of a pretty big following on YouTube. And he says, look, yeah, you might think the prison is unjust, hell is unjust or something, but we haven't been there, we don't know a lot of details about it. And he says, look, if someone's offering you a pardon to avoid this prison, which is what we have through Jesus Christ as an offer, don't reject that just because you think the prison is unjust. So I think that's a pretty good point. He also shows an analogy. He talks about an analogy of a spouse. Suppose my wife had a long affair many years ago for many years, and she divorced me, and then she comes back 20 years later and says, take me back, or whatever. You're not really obligated in that scenario to take them back. And he says it may be something like this going on with respect to when people ultimately reject God. And I think this is a powerful point. We struggle with hell because we as humans, we don't think sin is really that bad. We kind of want to just minimize it. But the view we see in the Bible is of a very holy God that doesn't like sin, because sin is hurting you or hurting others. It's very bad. And we can't we tend to underestimate that. And God in his holiness does think sin is really bad. So that's a key part as well. So there's a link to that. I can send these slides, and we ran out of time to get to the bears, but we can talk about Elisha and the bear some other time. But anyway, thank you guys. Sorry if we went a minute over here, but it was interesting for me to research all this. So thanks. All right, where's out to eat tonight?
I'm thinking doing Whataburger.
Cool.
So yeah, so it'll be Whataburger going out after this.
By Coin and Maple Shade.
Yes, the one by Court and Maple Shade, the one by all the other ones. I will put the address in the Discord. Because that Whataburger is the one that we have had people go to the other Whataburger.
Because there's two.